Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. I dare call it Murray's Ancient Warfare Answers because I'm, again, on my own. So here we are. We're answering one of your questions. This one's from Bruce via email. And you, of course, can ask us a question too. And this will be your weekly 10-minute Ancient Warfare fix. The question today is, what do the columns of Trajan, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius tell us about the wars depicted? Are they reliable narratives at all? Question mark. Oh, well, this is fascinating because obviously one of the most dominating landmarks in Rome is Trajan's column. And of course, one of the others is the column of Marcus Aurelius, even though it's not in the Forum of Rome. It is outside the Palazzo Chigi, which is the formal residence of the Italian Prime Minister. So, interestingly, the column of Marcus Aurelius is probably more prominent than being in the Roman Forum. But, of course, as tourists of Rome, we will tend to go to the Roman Forum one and look at Trajan's column. And certainly Trajan's column is the model, certainly the model for Marcus Aurelius's column. Now, the interesting thing there, of course, is that there have been columns erected for famous and successful generals for quite some time throughout antiquity. But the figured scenes that you get on Trajan's column and the column of Antoninus Pius and then Marcus Aurelius are different in the sense that they are incredibly complex. They tell a story and seem to be a narrative of a particular set of events. In the case of Trajan's column, it tells the story of his two campaigns into Dacia in the late 1st century AD and the early 2nd century AD. And in the case of Marcus Aurelius, you've got the narrative of the Marcomannic and Sarmatian wars in the 170s. Now, the fascinating thing about the columns is that the emperor is very obvious in both cases. Especially in the case of Marcus Aurelius and Trajan, and I'll concentrate on those two. And we have scenes which are identifiable. We have both columns begin with an army crossing a bridge of boats, the Danube. Both scenes have ad locutio scenes where the emperor addresses the army. We have scenes of barbarian, Dacian and or Germanic leaders bowing down in supplication, or indeed being decapitated, as is the case in several of them. Now, the interesting thing there is they seem to be specific narrative events and have indeed been used to narrate specific chronological events. But they are also, well, an army's got to march, an emperor's got to address the troops. And so are they generic or are they specific? Now, again, there are some moments on Trajan's column, such as the decapitation of Decibelus, which seem to be a specific event that is referred to in an image. And there are several of those. We're plagued in both cases of Trajan's column and Marcus Aurelius's column of not having enough source material to actually compare it to. With Marcus Aurelius's column, we've got two, or is it one, incident. We have the miracle of the rain, which is very obvious on Marcus Aurelius's column in scene 16. We also, in various stories of that rain miracle, get the idea that it was accompanied by lightning and thunder. Now, on the column, there is no lightning or thunder. There is an earlier scene of lightning striking a siege engine of the enemy, which is scene 10 and 11. And only the Scriptores Historiae Augustae mentions that there's thunderbolts and rain. Most of the sources combine the two into one thing, and that's not what we get on the column. So, interestingly, was it an event and the column doesn't match, but then it does kind of? One suggestion, of course, is that the life of Marcus in the SHA is actually reporting the scene on the column. So it says lightning bolt, rain, Bam. But again, sources are a problem. So it seems to be specific events. Certainly the miracle of the rain is one where you go, that is a specific event. It occurs very early on the column, however, in scene 16, and there's 100 and something scenes. So that's problematic in terms of the chronology of the column, with its 20 bands, winding their way up. That if the miracle of the rain is usually dated to 174, that's very early in the column to get to the wars at the end of 180 when Marcus Aurelius dies. So you then have the issue that they might not be chronological narratives. They might be anecdotal narratives and tell you this happened, this happened, this happened. And one of the reasons behind why the miracle of the rain is so early in the column is that if you're standing on the ground, you can see it, and it may have been one of the best known sort of anecdotes of the war, and therefore you can see it from the ground level. So it's not in the right place chronologically on the column, but it is visually accessible, which is possible. And there are several other scenes that might suggest an action and have certainly been interpreted that way, but they might not, because it's open to interpretation. One of the things, of course, with the column of Marcus Aurelius is we have no Lucius Verus, and he dies in January 169, and we have no Commodus. Now, that's problematic in the sense that Commodus is at the front with Marcus Aurelius from 175 onwards. So the problem then becomes, if it's got no Commodus, where's Commodus? Which also comes down to when it was built. Because if it was built under Commodus, which was one of the suggestions, and again, the evidence doesn't really help us, because the first piece of evidence we have is an inscription from 193 telling us about the fact that it's been built. So it's built by 193. The two suggestions are it's either built in 176 or it's built in 180. But that doesn't really answer where Commodus is. And again, some people have seen Commodus in two scenes, but is he really there? One suggestion is that the actual column is telling you the wars from 172 to 175, and it's erected in 176, hence no Commodus. Another version is that it's actually the later campaigns from 174 onwards. That's generally based on the fact that the miracle of the rain is dated to 174, and it's early. But then you have the problem that the later campaigns, Commodus was definitely with his father. So anyway, that's a problem. You've got other moments on the columns which seem to tell specific events. So on the column of both Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, most of the soldiers are wearing lorica segmentata. Certainly on Trajan's column, that's all they wear. Whereas on Marcus Aurelius' column, you get examples of lorica squamata, scale mail, and lorica hamata, chainmail. So there's a variation in equipment on Marcus Aurelius' column, which is interesting. On Trajan's column, you get very small shields, rectangular, curved scuta. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that even though no rectangular curved scuta survived, the ones on Trajan's column are a bit small, and they seem to be artistic, because otherwise they would dominate the imagery, and you wouldn't see anything else. We do, of course, have a testudo on both columns, made out of rectangular shields. But is that therefore a reason to reject it, or is it a reason to just say, well, that's an artistic license? The Adam Clissi monument, by contrast, has bigger shields. But, again, our problem is only one shield survives from antiquity, one Roman shield, and that's from the 3rd century at Europus. On Marcus Aurelius' column, by contrast, everyone has a curved oval shield, not a rectangular shield to be seen, except in that testudo image, which is problematic in itself, because, again, we don't tend to think of Roman legionaries as using curved oval shields. We tend to give those to the Praetorian Guard, and flat oval shields to the auxiliaries. So there's an issue there. And again, the Jura Europus shield tells us that even in the 3rd century there were still curved rectangular shields being used. So is this a different kind of artistic license? The other thing that's interesting with the column of Marcus Aurelius is all of the weaponry is carved, whereas with the column of Trajan, a lot of the weaponry was added later in metal, none of which survives. We think that both columns were painted. We know that, again, the spears of the men on Marcus Aurelius' column look to be more like hasta thrusting spears rather than pila. So they're not javelins in the way that were presumably shown on Trajan's column. So there's all sorts of aspects that they tell us information, but is it a reliable historical narrative? Probably not. Is it a narrative at all? Possibly not. And, endlessly fascinating, which hopefully answers some of your question, Bruce. I hope so. All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.